With the most recent chapter, Chapter 411 of MHA being released about a week ago, it's become entirely too evident that we are rapidly approaching the end of one of the most legendary stories ever told. And therefore, really the only question that remains is, how much more MHA do we have? And maybe more importantly than that, how will MHA come to a close? And while some might assume that it would be entirely impossible to predict how MHA will come to an end, I simply just don't subscribe to that line of thinking. See, I'll admit that the last year or so of MHA has been absolutely insane. In fact, if you described half the things that we saw from chapters 350 to now 411 to me when I was reading chapter 10, I would say you're describing an entirely different manga. I mean, just in the last 20 or so chapters, we've seen things like All Might turning into Iron Man with the powers of Class 1A. We've seen Bakugo brought back from basically the dead at the cost of Edgeshot's life, as Edgeshot was able to make himself borderline molecular and be a heart surgeon for Bakugo. And we have maybe, more importantly than anything, seen the death of All For One. And yeah, I'm not doing spoiler warnings. The video is called MHA's Ending Leaked. Do you think we were just going to be tiptoeing around the end of MHA here? And what's wild about these rapid hitting, incredibly important moments that are happening left, right, and center in MHA's final chapters is that moments that we would assume would be the most important moments in the entirety of the manga, like All For One's death, are immediately overshadowed by what appear to be more important moments and bigger fights. But I guess that kind of makes sense when you consider the context of things like All For One's demise, who was involved in that fight, and why his demise came to hand in the first place. Because objectively, even though All For One is one of the most important characters in all of MHA, there's two other characters that are more important than him currently locked in one of the longest fights in manga history. And thus, even though All For One's battles against basically everybody encapsulated the last 30 or so chapters, there was no time to grab a handful of dirt, throw it on his grave, and mourn his loss, because immediately after his loss, we switched right to Deku and Shigaraki, which is basically the only fight that could happen in MHA that would be more important than All For One versus everybody. Because for all intents and purposes, an all-out battle between a full-powered Deku and Shigaraki is what the entirety of MHA's manga has been building up towards. And like I've already said, this battle is already one of the longest in manga history, as Deku and Shigaraki started battling against each other in chapter 367. We are now on to chapter 411, which means that Deku and Shigaraki have been battling for 44 chapters, which means that they are 8 chapters short of battling for an entire year. Now, Horikoshi has definitely taken a couple of weeks off in the last year or so, and so in actuality, they've probably already been fighting for a year, but I think of years in terms of 52 manga releases. And considering the fact that Deku and Shigaraki are just now starting what's going to be their final fight, I think it's relatively fair to say that there's going to be at least 8 more chapters of this battle. So Deku and Shigaraki will accomplish the incredibly rare manga feat of battling for 52 chapters straight. Now, I'm obviously aware that we cut away from Deku and Shigaraki for 80 to 70% of those 52 chapters, but still, the fight's been going on for a long time, which is why we'll be able to hit that 52 chapter mark with relative ease. But relative ease is not what the MHA fandom is currently feeling. See, because while the manga has certainly gotten grittier, more violent, and more gory in the last 100 or so chapters, that shift in tone truly hasn't shifted the core tone of MHA all that much. See, MHA, while it has changed on a surface level, with Horikoshi drawing incredibly graphic, realistic, and terrifying images like All For One as a baby shooting a bone spear out of his mouth, or him releasing all of his quirks simultaneously to make a Gunji Ito type monster that he's going to use to accelerate across entire cities, or Horikoshi leaning into just how burned the likes of Dabi, Shoto, and Endeavor all got in their massive flame battle. But at the end of the day, all of these surface changes don't change the core of what MHA is, which is a feel-good high school story where everybody gets a happy ending. Well, at least everybody who doesn't fall into the unfortunate plot categorization of relevant enough to kill and have it make an impact, but not relevant enough to kill and have it destroy the story, like Crust, Miss Midnight, and basically everybody else who's died, with the only real exception obviously being All For One. However, All For One's demise, and more importantly the way it went down, has proved to me that I know exactly how this story is going to end. Because, like I said, MHA, while it might have changed its clothes, has not changed its character. And if anything, recent developments in the manga, most specifically the ending of Chapter 411, have proven to me that the theory that I made about how this story is going to end is all but guaranteed. And today I'll help you realize with the newest evidence possible that I am, in fact, correct about how the story is going to end. And thus you and me together can brace for the inevitable impact of a story that's been running, oh my god, for what? 8 years and has done more for the anime and manga community than 99.9% of stories ever told. But before we get to leaking the ending of MHA, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you like the idea of me discussing the endings of stories before you've written them, then you're gonna love my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Or if you just want to look like somebody who already knows the endings of all anime and manga, go ahead and meander on over into my merch store, otakusanonymous.net, where you can pick up some of the greatest anime t-shirts, sweatshirts, and sticker packs known to man. So, for the entirety of MHA, All For One has been the boogeyman, the center of evil, the man who only All Might, at the peak of his strength, ever stood a chance against. Anybody who's read or watched MHA knows that All For One is not the final baddie. See, while All For One might be the spoon that stirs the drink that is MHA, ever since the earliest chapters and earliest episodes of MHA, Shigaraki has been being set up as the true final baddie. And while for a long time we weren't sure as to why Shigaraki, who seemed relatively useless, was being set up in this massive role, however, now that Shigaraki has achieved what can be assumed to be 100% of his power in the manga, All For One having a fair amount of faith in his ability to become the ultimate tool of destruction now seems very justified. And really when it comes down to it, while All For One's plan was wide-sweeping and grandiose, the core of his plan, if you really wanted to boil it down to its simplest components, was to make Shigaraki evil. Brew hatred within Shigaraki's heart to make him the true ultimate weapon of destruction, who All For One could use as he's been manipulating him and controlling him since he was a child to bulldoze the entirety of Japan and probably the entirety of the world. And Shigaraki has become that weapon, a rolling ball of chaos and destruction, a Mach 36 flying entity with the ability to level the entirety of Japan in a week, all by using his now massively powered up decay ability. And thus, All For One got the inheritor that he wanted. All For One would be able to use Shigaraki's undamaged body and become the demon lord he always wanted to be, and live up to the level of evil that he read about in the comic books he read growing up. But there's one issue. All For One, possibly the smartest sentient being on Earth, and I don't say human because the principle of UA is a literal animal whose quirk makes him smart, didn't take into account the fact that Shigaraki wouldn't want to be taken over. And while do with that plot point as you will, ultimately the reason that All For One didn't take this into his calculations is because he was too focused on what he would accomplish with Shigaraki's body, which would inevitably be the taking of One For All. And thus, because All For One was so fixated on the goal, he forgot to acknowledge the process. What makes this moment either doubly annoying for us the readers, or All For One, depending on whether or not you're okay with the fact that All For One didn't take into account the fact that Shigaraki would fight back, or at least fight back as hard as he did, is that Shigaraki has displayed the ability now in chapter 410 and 411 to do exactly what All For One wanted him to be able to do, and that is absorb One For All. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how good of a match Shigaraki is for All For One, or whether or not he can take One For All, because All For One will never get a chance to take over Shigaraki's body, because he's dead and gone, Benjamin Buttoned into oblivion, which was fine. Listen, it's not how I would have conducted the story, but I understand the approach. It worked in a good way to get Bakugo and All Might involved in the story in a way that legitimately mattered without them relying on Deku, and it made for some absolutely riveting and engaging fights that I can't wait to see animated. Now, technically, if I was telling the story, I would have had All Might and Bakugo wear down All For One until he was very weak, but I still would have had All For One get to Shigaraki. However, after All For One got to Shigaraki, I would have had Shigaraki finish the job. I feel like the separation between All For One and Shigaraki wasn't definitive enough, and I feel like that would have served as a better moment for Shigaraki to step into the sun as the final bad guy in the story. Once again, not me writing it. But while I am okay with how All For One dies, his death and the way that he's died has proved to me beyond any reasonable doubt that I know how this story will end. Now, using the most recent evidence, I can prove that I have a pretty much 99% chance of being correct here. So let's talk about the prediction that I made a couple of months ago, and how I came to that conclusion in the first place. See, the prediction that I made a couple of months ago was predicated off a small but rather important moment in the battle between Shigaraki and Deku. This was early on in the fight. But see, early on in this historic battle, Shigaraki has a moment where he kind of breaks down, but it's not really Shigaraki breaking down. See, Shigaraki, while battling against Deku at full power, seems to accidentally let something slip. And that something is the little boy that still lives within Shigaraki. Or as Deku refers to it nowadays, the human inside of Shigaraki. Now, this human inside of Shigaraki lashes out at Deku. And basically, when Deku is trying to bring Shigaraki to his side, the human inside of Shigaraki says, "But I have friends," then goes on listing all the friends Shigaraki had as a child. Or something like that. It was like 50 chapters ago. Basically, the important takeaway here is that there is a child living within Shigaraki, or a human soul. And in this moment, Deku, and possibly us as the reader, are supposed to realize, oh, Shigaraki's still got a good side to him. Maybe under that rolling ball of decaying chaos, there's still a human soul that we can reach. Because at the end of the day, one of the most popular theories in the entirety of the MHA fandom is that All For One gave Shigaraki the decay quirk in order to make sure that inevitably he would kill his entire family and turn to evil. And there is a fair amount of evidence to back up that point, because All For One seems a bit too conveniently placed into Shigaraki's life after he kills his entire family. Not to mention that All For One already had some beef with and information on Shigaraki's family, as Shigaraki's grandmother was, I believe, the 7th inheritor of All For One, Nana Shimura. And thus, since All For One stepped into Shigaraki's life so early, and Shigaraki's break happened so early in his life, there remains within Shigaraki an emotionally stunted little boy who never got the chance to live a standard childhood. And in psychology, this is actually relatively common. It's often said in psychological circles that if something traumatic enough happens to you as a child, it can stunt you from maturing any further beyond the time in which you were traumatized. However, because All For One stepped into Shigaraki's life during this traumatic event, he managed to help a new version of Shigaraki come to rise. A demonic, chaotic, hating version of Shigaraki that simply wanted to destroy all the things around him. However, while this new version of Shigaraki was being grown, the old version of Shigaraki wasn't replaced, but simply put away. A version of Shigaraki that wanted a regular childhood, a non-abusive father, and a quirk that didn't kill everything he touched. But because of All For One, that version of Shigaraki has never gotten the chance to exist, and thus that child has been trying to break out for the entirety of Shigaraki's life. But the conditioning and hardships Shigaraki has been through pushed that child down. But now, since we and Deku have seen that lash out, we and Deku are supposed to believe that while Deku's battling against Shigaraki, that there's a way out of this fight, and that is by appealing to the human side of Shigaraki, not the new, devastating, decaying version of Shigaraki that wants to level all of Japan. And thus, since Deku knows that there's still a human soul in Shigaraki, he's not necessarily been going for the kill for the last 50 chapters. But that's not to say that Deku could kill Shigaraki if he wanted to. In fact, the gap in their strength is rather glaring, and the prospects of Deku winning in an all-out battle against Shigaraki by himself seems slim to none, as Deku, now over the course of this fight against Shigaraki, has activated second gear twice. Or gear shift, you get it. And the original owner of it has told him that this second activation of gear shift will be his last. However, Deku understood that it was necessary to activate it in order to fling Bakugo at All For One to make sure that All For One wouldn't be able to kill All Might. However, since Deku has now activated gear shift for what will be his last time, he has at most 5 minutes to beat Shigaraki. As after the conclusion of this gear shift, Deku's body will most likely shut down. Now, will Deku go beyond plus ultra after those 5 minutes are up, grit his teeth, and put his back into it like his predecessor? I mean, probably. But I don't think any of that really matters in the end, because I genuinely believe, regardless of how hard Deku struggles, or powers up for that matter, he isn't nearly as strong as Shigaraki. But that doesn't mean that he won't win. Of course, he'll win. But Deku's not going to win by beating Shigaraki to a pulp. See, Deku will, at least unfortunately to me, win by appealing to the human side within Shigaraki. And once that human side begins to reappear, it will serve as a temporary crack in Shigaraki's impenetrable armor, and Deku will be able to take advantage of that crack. See, as we all know, regular humans aren't supposed to have multiple quirks. As the more quirks you get, the, let's say, slower you get, as has happened to both Spinner and Gigantomachia. Now, technically, this doesn't really apply to wielders of All For One or One For All, as One For All only gave Deku meta abilities, and the resiliency quirks that come along with All For One make sure that the wielders' bodies are strong enough to hold that many quirks. However, I believe that with the ending of MHA, we're going to be seeing a FMAB type moment, where the human side of Shigaraki begins to peak out, and it begins to impair his ability to control all of the quirks. And thus slowly over time, as the human inside of him begins to rage out and try to break to the surface, just like how Father loses control over all the souls that make him his strongest form in the ending of FMAB, Shigaraki will lose control over all the quirks that he currently has access to. Kind of like what just happened with All For One, whose death is supposed to act kind of as a pseudo, this is what happens if you ever lose control of All For One kind of example. And while All For One lost control of All For One because of the copy of the quirk that he got that required Aries quirk, which made him younger and younger the more that he used that quirk factor, Shigaraki won't lose control of All For One because he's getting younger, but because his younger self is shining through. But the question is, Nick, how will Deku make that appeal? How will Deku reach out to the human inside of Shigaraki and cause them to rage? Well, maybe not rage, but begin to break to the surface. Well, it probably won't really be up to Deku. See, I believe that Shigaraki will continue to absorb Deku's meta abilities. Kind of how like Shigaraki has already absorbed Deku's danger sense. While these new meta abilities will increase the gap in strength between Deku and Shigaraki exponentially, it will actually spell Shigaraki's demise. See, because here's the thing. There's no reason that Shigaraki would only take one quirk. Yes, technically that is a good way to set up the fact that Shigaraki stands a chance of taking One For All, something that All For One wanted his entire life, but you can do that by not having him take any of Deku's quirks. So Shigaraki could get a hand on Deku and begin to absorb the quirks, and everybody inside of Deku could be like, oh my god, he can actually absorb us. Or they could simply just tell us that Shigaraki in this current form has the ability to absorb Deku's quirks. But showing us physically that Shigaraki has the ability to absorb Deku's quirks, while it is technically good writing, also, to me at least, pays credence to the idea that Shigaraki is going to end up with more of Deku's quirks. And narratively, this kind of makes sense. See, here's the thing about Deku's quirks, or meta abilities. Really, when it comes down to it, the only one of the meta abilities that we ever saw Deku train with was Black Whip. And thus a lot of the other abilities like Fajin and Gear Shift and Smoke and Danger Sense all kind of just appeared one day. But MHA has never been a story about Deku being handed things. In fact, MHA at its brightest moments has been a story about Deku wrestling the things he wasn't supposed to have from others through hard work. And thus narratively, if Deku was to defeat Shigaraki with all of these meta abilities that we never really saw him train with, it would kind of look like, to us the readers, that he didn't work for that win. And while obviously Deku had to train very hard to master any of the meta abilities, when it comes down to it, the things that we need to see Deku win this fight with are the things that we know he fought tooth and nail for. And thus, so long as Deku holds on to One For All and maybe Black Whip and wins using those abilities, we as viewers would see that Deku had stepped up to the plate in a big way and had finally filled the shoes of All Might, because All Might was able to beat All For One with just One For All. But there's more reasons than just, oh, I want to see Deku hit Shigaraki with a Detroit Smash. Real reason that Shigaraki will continue to absorb Deku's meta abilities isn't to make Shigaraki stronger, but weaker. See, I genuinely believe that with every single meta ability that Shigaraki rips from Deku, he will be taking a part of Deku with him. See, because a spiritual projection of Deku lives within Deku that interfaces with all of the other previous wielders of One For All. And thus, this spiritual projection of Deku has a connection to all these other previous wielders. And therefore, when all of these previous wielders are ripped on over to Shigaraki, I believe with every single one taken, a piece of Deku will also go. Until eventually, there's enough of Deku's spirit within Shigaraki that Deku can begin the internal battle. And since Shigaraki technically has no way to purge the quirks in his body outside of giving them to other people, by the time that Shigaraki realizes that he's absorbed too much of Deku and now that version of Deku can appeal to the human side of Shigaraki that's buried under the rubble of Shigaraki's life, it'll be too late. And Deku will be able to bring this human side of Shigaraki to the light for the first time in decades. And thus, he'll fix Shigaraki. And in this moment, we'll see that the real reason that All For One was never able to steal One For All is because in order to hold on to One For All, you still need your humanity intact. However, it's also going to show us that All For One wielders shouldn't want to pull in One For All, because the light of humanity pulled in through One For All will always overpower the darkness of All For One. And while I know this ending sounds incredibly cliche and kind of boring, I am 99% certain that the ending will look like some variation of what I just told you. Because, like I said earlier, even though MHA has changed its clothes, it hasn't changed its character. And MHA tends to deliver what happened to be rather cliche endings. Not that that's a bad thing. You can tell an incredibly good story that follows the path of the hero's journey, and that's just what MHA is doing. There's nothing wrong with being formulaic so long as you follow the formula in a way that's unique to you and pays off in a satisfying way. And MHA has never been a story about mass death and side character losses. It's sky high in Japan. Now, if hypothetically All Might had died, or Bakugo had died, or if Bakugo had lost, or didn't come back into the fray until it was too late to stop All for One, or possibly didn't come back to life until Eri was able to come to the battlefield and rewind him back to a point where he was alive, or really if anybody of importance that wasn't a member of the League of Villains died, I would say then yes, there's a possibility that the Deku and Shiki fight will end in some other way that's not, oh Shigaraki, you're a human too. But considering the fact that we already got this fight in female form, Uraka versus Toga, I really can't see this fight breaking the MHA mold. And yes, Deku versus Shigaraki is literally Uraka versus Toga. Toga's a demon that wants to destroy the world and live by her own rules. Uraka sees the human inside Toga and battles her with that in mind. Until eventually Uraka is able to make Toga see that she is a human, and then Toga lets herself die. Listen, I would even say that this fight has the possibility to break the mold if All for One made it to Shigaraki and Shigaraki finished him off, because that would have been a true definitive moment of Shigaraki not being a human and ascending above the Demon Lord himself. But with All for One dying of kind of his own volition, Shigaraki is still technically redeemable, because all he's really done is killed nameless characters and wiped out cities filled with people who we've never seen. Now, I'm not saying that Shigaraki is going to join Class 1A. In fact, the story will most likely end with either his death or imprisonment. But unfortunately, or fortunately, if you like stories that don't traumatize you, Horikoshi writes in a somewhat predictable manner, and that manner tends to follow all the standard rules and practices of the hero's journey. And I know these stories very well because Naruto did the exact same thing with Itachi, Nagato, and Pain. And people beloved those stories. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with doing that. And in fact, the last 100 to 150 chapters of MHA have been my favorite chapters of MHA. But it's still easily predictable. But what do you guys think? How do you see MHA coming to a close in the next couple of months? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Listen, I could be wrong. I just don't think it's likely.